Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss powerful stories like this one. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you deeply researched, human stories that deserve to be told. Frank Fritz spent most of his life uncovering other people's forgotten pasts. He dug through dusty barns, locked garages, and collapsing sheds, rescuing objects that carried memories no one else cared to preserve. But when Frank's own life quietly came to an end, the biggest shock wasn't the fame, the lawsuits, or even the public fallout from television. What stunned everyone was what he had been secretly building for decades. When close friends and authorities finally opened his estate, they realized Frank had been telling one final story all along, one that was far more complex, emotional, and unsettling than anyone imagined. The man millions thought they knew was only a surface version. What lay beneath revealed discipline, pain, obsession, and a lifetime of silent preparation. To millions of viewers, Frank Fritz felt familiar, almost comforting. He was the quiet half of American Pickers, the bearded collector who balanced Mike Wolfe's fast-talking energy with calm observation. Frank didn't rush conversations. He listened. He respected homeowners and treated their memories with care. On screen, he appeared simple, a guy who loved old motorcycles, rusted signs, and forgotten tools. But television rarely tells the whole truth. Off camera, Frank lived a life defined by structure, restraint, and long periods of isolation. He wasn't careless or impulsive. He was methodical. Everything he collected had meaning, and everything he kept had a reason. Fame never changed who he was, it only made it harder for him to stay invisible. And invisibility, as it turns out, was where Frank felt safest. Frank Fritz was born in Davenport, Iowa, in October 1963. From a young age, he stood apart from other kids. While classmates chased trends, Frank chased stories. He collected rocks, coins, old cans, stamps, and even discarded objects others saw as trash. But this wasn't hoarding. Frank wanted to understand where things came from and why they survived. He believed history lived in everyday objects, not museums. That belief never left him. Teachers noticed his curiosity, but few understood it. Frank wasn't loud or attention-seeking. He observed. He remembered. He studied where patterns, scratches, and imperfections like clues at a crime scene. Even as a child, he was training himself for the life he would eventually live, one rooted in patience, memory, and preservation. After attending school in Iowa, Frank chose a path that confused many around him. College didn't interest him. He believed real knowledge came from touch, time, and repetition, not classrooms. Instead, he built a long, stable career as a fire inspector, a job he held for nearly 25 years. It was technical, demanding, and required extreme attention to detail. Without realizing it, the job sharpened the very instincts that later made him famous. Inspecting old buildings taught Frank how to spot inconsistencies, understand structural history, and recognize what survived when everything else failed. While others saw decay, Frank saw value. And through it all, his collecting never stopped. Every flea market, garage sale, and roadside stop became another chapter in his quiet education. At just 16 years old, Frank bought his first Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a purchase that shocked his parents. He worked multiple jobs to afford it, convinced he wasn't buying transportation but saving history. That philosophy followed him for life. Motorcycles weren't machines to Frank, they were stories on wheels. Each one carried fingerprints of the people who rode it, fixed it, and relied on it. Over time, his collection grew, but never randomly. Frank documented everything mentally, sometimes physically, building an internal map of where each piece came from and why it mattered. This wasn't impulse collecting. It was intentional preservation. When Frank opened Frank's Finds in Savannah, Illinois, the shop felt overwhelming to some visitors. It was dark, dense, and packed from floor to ceiling. Firehouse memorabilia, motorcycle parts, tools, and forgotten Americana filled every inch. But to Frank, it was organized chaos. Each item had a place and a purpose. What customers didn't realize was that this shop was only the surface layer. The most important pieces were never meant for casual viewing. They were stored elsewhere, protected, documented, and hidden from public curiosity. Frank wasn't building a business alone, he was building an archive. Frank met Mike Wolfe in 8th grade. They weren't instant best friends, but they shared the same unusual curiosity. While others chased popularity, Frank and Mike chased barns. Their personalities were different from the start. Mike dreamed big and talked fast. Frank focused on the object itself. After high school, their paths diverged but never fully separated. Mike pushed the idea of turning picking into something bigger. Frank preferred stability and control. Fame didn't interest him. But over time, small successes convinced Frank his instincts worked anywhere, not just inside his shop. When American Pickers premiered in 2010, it exceeded every expectation. Viewers connected instantly. Mike energized the screen, but Frank grounded it. He asked about memories, not money. Audiences trusted him. Within months, the show pulled millions of viewers per episode. Fans lined up for autographs, often overwhelming Frank. He never understood the attention, but stayed until the last fan left. Fame didn't excite him, it confused him. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Production tightened schedules. Authenticity slowly slipped. Frank didn't want to be a character. He wanted to be himself. Long before fame, Frank lived with Crohn's disease, a painful and exhausting condition. Flare-ups drained his energy and caused constant discomfort. On set, he pushed through anyway. As fame grew, anxiety followed. He was prescribed Xanax. Alcohol slowly became a coping mechanism. Frank later admitted that fame amplified everything he was already struggling with. In 2017, those struggles became public after his DUI arrest. It shattered the image fans had of him and deeply humiliated Frank. A severe back injury required major surgery, leaving Frank with rods in his spine. Recovery was brutal. Pain medication entered his life. During this time, Frank felt abandoned. He later said Mike never checked on him. Whether intentional or not, that silence cut deeply. When production required a clean drug test to return, Frank couldn't pass it. His final episode aired quietly. To the public, it looked like time off. To Frank, it felt like erasure. Everything Frank Fritz had built over decades collapsed in a single moment. In July 2022, a close friend arrived at Frank's Iowa farmhouse expecting a normal visit. Instead, he found Frank lying helpless on the floor, unable to speak, barely able to move, his body locked in a frightening stillness. At first, it looked like a seizure. Emergency services rushed him to the hospital, but doctors soon confirmed the devastating truth. Frank had suffered a massive stroke. The damage was severe and immediate. Parts of his brain responsible for movement, speech, and reasoning were permanently affected. He survived, but the man who emerged from that hospital was not the Frank the world remembered. His independence was gone. The picker who once crawled through barns and lifted heavy relics could no longer lift his own arm. The stroke didn't just injure his body, it erased the future he believed he still had time to live. After weeks in intensive care and rehabilitation, doctors made a painful assessment. Frank could no longer safely live on his own. He struggled with basic tasks, couldn't reliably communicate his needs, and required constant medical supervision. The court stepped in, placing him under legal guardianship. His close friend Chris Davis was appointed to make personal decisions, while a financial institution took control of his money. For a man who had spent his entire life valuing independence, this was devastating. Frank's world shrank overnight. Choices he once made freely, what to eat, where to go, how to spend his time, were no longer his. Visitors later said the hardest part wasn't just his physical limitations. It was the look in his eyes. Frank understood exactly what had been taken from him. He was trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him, fully aware of every loss. Frank's medical care was extensive and relentless. Around-the-clock supervision, rehabilitation therapy, medication for Crohn's disease, respiratory treatment, and specialized equipment quickly drove costs to nearly $30,000 a month. His income could not keep up. Investment returns barely made a dent. Savings he believed would last a lifetime began draining faster than anyone expected. For someone who had quietly prepared for the future through collecting and preservation, this was a cruel twist. Frank had saved history, but now his own survival depended on systems he could no longer control. Friends said that over time, the fight slowly left him, not because he wanted to die, but because the life he loved was already gone. What made Frank's situation especially painful was his awareness. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He knew he had suffered a stroke. He knew he couldn't return to American Pickers. He knew he would never roam back roads again. Friends described moments where Frank tried to speak, growing frustrated when words wouldn't come out. He would attempt to lift his arm, watching it fall back uselessly. That awareness weighed heavily on him. Some said he became quieter, more withdrawn. Others noticed flashes of anger, grief, and sadness. Frank wasn't just mourning his health, he was mourning his identity. The picker, the collector, the historian, that version of him was gone. In 2023, something unexpected happened. Mike Wolfe visited Frank. There were no cameras, no producers, no audience, just two men sitting with decades of shared history between them. It was emotional, restrained, and deeply personal. Whatever resentment existed had lost its power. Fame no longer mattered. Arguments no longer mattered. What remained was time, time that could not be recovered. Those close to Frank said the visit brought a sense of closure, even if it came too late. Frank would never return to television, but that moment allowed both men to face what had been lost without performance or pressure. When Frank Fritz passed away in late September, those closest to him began the difficult task of settling his estate. At first, everything looked normal. Personal belongings, paperwork, tools, but then they opened the locked garages and storage buildings. What they found stopped everyone cold. This wasn't clutter. This wasn't random collecting. It was a carefully constructed archive, Frank's private world, preserved exactly the way he wanted it. Every item had a place. Every object had meaning. It was clear immediately that Frank had been preparing for this moment for decades. Inside the garage stood more than 75 vintage motorcycles, arranged with intention. Some were fully restored. Others waited patiently for parts Frank had already sourced and documented. Indian motorcycles, Harley-Davidsons, rare British machines from Vincent, BSA, and Triumph. Some dated back over a century. Experts were stunned. Among them was a one-of-a-kind Indian chief prototype believed to be lost to history, valued at over $250,000 on its own. This wasn't just a collection. It was a museum that no one knew existed. Beyond the motorcycles were discoveries no one was prepared for. Aerosmith's long-lost tour van from their earliest days sat quietly in storage. Nearby were rare pop culture artifacts, including early Yoda prototypes from Star Wars that insiders believed had been destroyed decades earlier. Each item had documentation, handwritten notes, provenance, context. Frank hadn't just collected these things, he had protected their stories. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was Frank's journals, dozens of them, page after page of careful handwriting detailing where items came from, who owned them before, and what it took to rescue them. But mixed in were personal thoughts. Frank wrote about isolation after leaving the show, about feeling pushed aside, about people circling his property when his health declined. He didn't fear death. He feared losing control over what he built. Those journals revealed the truth. Frank never stopped telling stories. Even in silence, he was documenting his own. As estate values climbed toward $6 million, disputes followed. Lawsuits, accusations, competing claims of loyalty. Suddenly, everyone said they knew Frank best. But the truth was already written in his collections, his journals, and the life he lived quietly. Frank Fritz spent his life preserving history. In the end, his own life became the most complex artifact of all. So the question remains, should his legacy belong to family or to the friends who stood by him when everything fell apart? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that deserve to be remembered.